Good morning. I'm Vincent Rougeau, president of the College of the Holy Cross, and your plenary moderator. This morning's plenary speaker will share his thoughts on how Catholic social teaching can be used for the good of our economy. So joining us via Zoom this morning is Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey D. Sachs is a university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 to 2016. He is president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, co-chair of the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, academician of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences at the Vatican, and Tan Sri Jeffrey Chia Honorary Distinguished Professor at Sunway University. He has been special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General and currently serves as an SDG advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, where he received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees. Sachs has received 41 honorary doctorates, and his recent awards include the 2022 Tang Prize in Sustainable Development, the Legion of Honor by decree of the President of the Republic of France, and the Order of the Cross from the President of Estonia. His most recent book is The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions, which was published in 2020. After Jeff concludes his remarks, we will have a few minutes to engage him in some audience Q&A. So please be ready with your questions. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you very, very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. What a great honor it is to be with the ACCU. Thank you for asking me to speak about Catholic social teachings and what they can add to the economic life and also to our economics teaching, because I also want to discuss what we do as universities and colleges, how we teach economics, how we impart ideas about the economy to our students who, of course, will be strongly influenced and I hope motivated in the way that we teach. I believe that the Catholic social teachings offer a vital resource for the world at a very perilous time. We're facing many global crises, and many of these relate strongly to economic life. Of course, we're facing an ecological crisis of unprecedented dimensions, including human-induced climate change, the loss of biodiversity, the massive pollution of our air and water and soils, and the overuse or exploitation, the destructive use of many ecological systems around the world. We're also facing unprecedented inequalities. Within the United States, we know that inequality has increased dramatically, almost unrecognizably, during the past 40 years, from a society in which we thought almost everybody both self-identified as middle class and a society that one hoped was moving towards equality. For 4 decades now, we have had widening inequalities, soaring wealth at the top, and hard poverty at the bottom. And so the United States itself is, for us, immediately a dramatic day-to-day example of what is not working in our economic life. Our economy is not producing prosperity for all, to say the least. Our economy is not producing the kinds of social justice we long for. Our economy is not producing environmental safety. And what's happening in the United States has resonance with what's happening around the world. The world as a whole is in the midst of the ecological crises. The world as a whole is experiencing widening inequalities. The world as a whole is experiencing profound disruptions of economic life. And not only the long-term trends, but the shocks, of course, of COVID and now the war in Ukraine, which has deeply disrupted the world economy. My view is that these failures of economic life, first, need to be addressed. Second, are the core aim of the field of economics. So we should be teaching critical thinking and problem solving to our students because we face problems that need to be addressed, problems of poverty, problems of ecological destruction, problems of failure of cooperation across nations, too much conflict, too much war, not enough peaceful cooperation. And I view these broadly as crises of our material life and to a very important and direct extent, crises of our economic life. The Catholic social teachings, and I'm speaking not only of the great magisterium of the church that goes back to the Gospels, but also the series of encyclicals that began with Rerum Novarum in 1891 and have continued to our day with the two great encyclicals of Pope Francis, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, offer a body of crucial insights, in my opinion, that are a gift not only for Catholics, but for the whole world, and offer ways to think about the economy and to teach about the economy that are extremely important for our time. And I've seen also, and I think we've all experienced how these teachings have had manifold direct effects on world society for the good over the course of many, many decades. I'll just mention a few that I have felt and experienced. The first goes back now 60 years to Pacem in Terris, which was the encyclical on how governments should relate to each other for moral statecraft. And the message of Pope John the 23rd was that acting in the pursuit of peace is a moral requirement of governments, and it is also a skill, a kind of political virtue. And Pacem in Terris was issued in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It made a deep impression on world leaders, especially on President John F. Kennedy and on his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, and it helped to induce those two leaders at the height of the Cold War to agree to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. In 1991, I had the great personal fortune and blessing to be an advisor to Centesimus Annus, the encyclical of John Paul II, on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. So it was the 100th anniversary of the modern Catholic social teachings, but it was in the context of the revolutions of democracy and the end of the Soviet economic life of Central and Eastern Europe. And at the time, I was serving as an advisor to the Solidarity movement and then to the Polish government. So I was asked by the Vatican to come, and my good fortune to help advise Pope John Paul II as he was drafting Centesimus Annus in the wake of the revolutions of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989, and how he emphasized that a market economy, which was coming to Central Europe, must be founded on ethical principles. And this is the core point of the Catholic social teachings. Economic life is not free markets. Economic life is an economy that is foundationally based on ethics that I'll discuss in just a moment. Then I was mentioning, I think, when we were dropped, that Pope John Paul II in 1999 called for debt justice for poor countries and a jubilee year in the year 2000. And that led to adopting by the world's governments and the International Monetary Fund the Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative, or the HIPC initiative, which relieved the debts of many poor countries. And then in this past decade, Pope Francis's key encyclicals, Laudato Si, helped to pave the way for the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I hope and believe that Fratelli Tutti, which is an encyclical about peaceful encounter and cooperation, can help us to end this horrible war in Ukraine. My point of mentioning these historical episodes is that the Catholic social teachings are not only a remarkable, and I would say in many ways unique, compendium of ethical insights, but also have had very practical import in the world and can in the world of economics. I would like to share my screen to go through some of these issues in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to try that if I can do that. So let me just ask if you can see that screen. Great, thank you very much. So I want to speak about Catholic social teachings and economic ethics in a bit of a formal way, and as we do with colleges and universities, and also to reflect on what it means for how we should teach economics. I'll start with the statement that Pope Francis made on March 8, 2019, when he was hosting a meeting of religious leaders and the Sustainable Development Goals. And he said that economic and political objectives, quote, must be sustained by ethical objectives, which presuppose a change of attitude, what the Bible would call a change of heart. So at the core of economic and political objectives, like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Climate Agreement, are ethical objectives. And yet we rarely teach about ethics or the foundational bases on which our economic and political objectives should rest. There is a big difference between the Church's social teachings and what we teach in economics class. And this has long historical roots, I would emphasize. The Church's social teachings are a kind of virtue ethics, and as is often said, they derive from a combination of Athens and Jerusalem, or Aristotle and the Gospels. St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was the great synthesizer of Aristotle and Jesus's teachings and the Gospels, and through Pope Leo XIII, Thomas Aquinas' teachings became the basis of the modern Catholic social teaching, starting with the encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891. Now, the economics that we teach has a very different philosophical root and historical root. It is Anglo-Saxon. Modern economics that we teach arose in Britain, and it gained its huge influence because of the British Empire, and in the United States, of course, because we are heirs to Britain directly, ideologically, philosophically, intellectually, in many ways. So Anglo-Saxon economic ethics that we teach, sometimes only implicitly, not explicitly, does not derive from Aristotle and the Gospels. It derives from Hobbes, from Locke, from Hume, from Adam Smith. It has very different principles. It's premised on insatiable desires, on self-interest, on competition, and it's underpinned by a belief in a providential, invisible hand, which was Smith's idea about how a market system operates. It's an overly optimistic view, and it is not one that delivers the kind of ethical outcomes that we are seeking. So in Anglo-Saxon economics, as dominates our universities today, the following ethical principles derived from British empiricism are taken basically for granted. Sometimes they're not even explained. The first is that economic life is transactional, not relational. Economic life is about an individual's relations to market commodities, not to other people. It's a very individualistic ethics. You buy and sell goods, you buy and sell labor. But the meaning of those transactions is with the goods, not with the other people that you transact with. Now, this is very basic because in Catholic social teachings, economics is transactional. You work not only to earn an income, but you work to relate to other people and to contribute to society. It leads to very different conclusions. A second assumption is that the invisible hand of the free market ensures the common good. This I would regard as a matter of complacency. It's an analytical error and a practical error. Smith was an extremely decent man, by the way, a great humanist, but his idea of the invisible hand was much too optimistic. A third ethical assumption is that individuals' preferences are given. In fact, we learned this basically the first day of economics. We're told people have tastes, they have preferences. Don't ask where they come from. You take them as given, and then individuals try to maximize those preferences, businesses try to maximize the profits given the preferences of the people, and according to the invisible hand, many good things can happen. So preferences are given. They're not learned, they're not cultivated. Whereas in classical Greek ethics and classical Greek ethics as received by the church, of course, preferences are formed. They're formed by learning. They're formed by moral instruction. They're formed by habit. They are cultivated. We are to learn to be good people. We are to be taught to be good people. They're not just taken as given like Hobbes, that people have insatiable demands for wealth, power, glory, but rather people should learn to moderate their preferences or to abide by the common good. So that's the fourth point. For Aristotle, moderation in all things is the great moral objective. For Hobbes, economic wants are just assumed to be insatiable. You can never have enough. And we learned this on the first day of economics also. We have utility functions, and the more, the better. And the aim is to get more. And then a fifth assumption in British empiricism is that non-cooperation is pretty much unavoidable because people pursue their individual self-interest. Hobbes wrote the Leviathan to overcome that by having a central, strong state. But he said it wasn't possible through ethics to overcome self-interest. So this is the ethical presumptions of Anglo-Saxon economics. When I learned economics 50 years ago, this was not explained to me as a kind of ethics. This was just taken as granted. This was a kind of normal human behavior that I should just assume. It's actually a very odd set of assumptions. Certainly, it's not the view of human beings of the church. It's not the view of human beings of Aristotle. It's not the view of human beings of Aquinas, but it is the view of human beings of Hobbes, Hume, and Smith. So this is a starting point for us. Something is a little bit off. And remember Adam Smith's couple of famous lines from The Wealth of Nations. He says, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves, not to their humanity, but to their self-love." In other words, when we go to the butcher or the baker, we buy things from them. We don't say, you should be nice to us. We buy things. But The truth is, when we go to the butcher or the baker or our favorite neighborhood restaurant, we have human relations with the butcher, the baker, and the restaurant owner. We don't expect them to poison us, to cheat on the portions, to give us dangerous food. We expect that there will be benevolence in those relations. We believe that those are relationships not just with the meat, the beer, or the bread, but also with the butcher, the brewer, or the baker. And of course, the bottom quote there is the most famous quote of Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, where he says, by directing that industry in such a manner as it produces, as its produce may be of the greatest value, that is market value, he intends only his own gain, that is the producer is profit maximizing. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. So the idea of the invisible hand is that, paradoxically, we get the common good out of individual self-interest. There are elements of genius in that idea, but it's taken greatly to excess because greed also leads to plunder, it leads to irresponsibility, it leads to abuse of power, both market power and political power. It doesn't, and it can lead to mass suffering of poor people who were often told by the British, oh, you're hungry? Don't worry about it. The market will solve your problem. And the result in the 19th century on several occasions was mass death from famine that the invisible hand certainly did not solve. So the Catholic social teachings have a very different historical and ethical basis. And I just want to mention several of these because I think that they also relate directly to how economies work and what we should be teaching about economics. First, according to Thomas Aquinas, the aim of economic life is felicitas. It's not wealth, it's happiness on earth. That's a big difference. Some wealth is good. We need it for our sustenance. But too much wealth, if that's the only pursuit of an individual, can be highly destructive. The goal is happiness, or felicitas, as Aquinas called it, not just accumulation of wealth. A second key principle is that all human beings are imago Dei, created in the image of God, meaning that all human beings have the right to human dignity and the right to their portion of the creation. And that's the third basic principle, economic principle of the Catholic social teachings, the universal destination of goods, that the earth belongs to all and that the economy is to help meet the needs of all. This is not the starting point of free market economics. It's not even mentioned, the idea that an economy should meet at least the basic needs of all people in it. We don't learn that. Maybe you hear that in an ethics class, but not in an economics course. Another core principle is that private property is not inviolable. The church favors private property in the Catholic social teachings, but not private property rights above social responsibility. So private property must give way in the face of poverty and exclusion, and I'll come back to that in a moment. A fifth point that I've already mentioned is that economic life is relational and integral, meaning that it involves the whole person, not just a person as a consumer or as a producer or as a supplier of labor. Hence, the church follows the doctrine of integral development, that is, economic life that promotes the whole individual and family. The sixth point is that humans are stewards, not masters of creation. And this is the point emphasized by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. The seventh point is that happiness depends on the virtues of the individuals and society rather than on wealth maximization. The idea of virtue, of course, is the core of Greek ethical teaching. It is the core of Catholic ethical teaching, the four cardinal virtues of practical wisdom, bravery, moderation, and justice, together with the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. But virtue is not mentioned in an economics class. Even the idea of the cardinal virtues, the so-called secular virtues, practical wisdom or justice or temperance, moderation, not mentioned. According to Aristotle and Aquinas and the church's social teachings, virtues must be cultivated. They don't just emerge. In fact, Aristotle says young people can't be virtuous. It takes time to learn practical wisdom. And virtues are cultivated by education, by mentorship, by experience, by what the Greeks called habitus, or habit formation, to learn to be good. The economic virtues include temperance, trustworthiness, friendship, civility. Remember that chapter 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle is friendship. Friendship is viewed as a virtue. It's viewed as an excellence. It's viewed as something that has to be learned, how to be a good friend. And therefore, it is part of the virtues of economic life as well. There are many kinds of virtues, and this I'd like to emphasize, that need to be cultivated, and many of the encyclicals deal with different dimensions of virtues. Civic virtues, that is, our virtues as citizens, includes virtues of fairness, respect for others, and a quest for the truth. Corporate virtues should aim for corporate responsibility to society, not to try to make profits by harming others, not by making addictive products and then making a lot of money from them, but rather making healthful products and contributing real value to society. Political virtues is not just a struggle for power, but should aim for the common good. And geopolitical virtues is not who can win in a war or who's on top or who's the global hegemon, but how to achieve peace and dialogue among nations. So the Catholic social teachings, through the encyclicals Since Rerum Novarum, treat each of these in great beauty and in great sophistication and in great depth. For example, geopolitical virtues are treated in Pacem in Terris, and the sustainable virtues are treated in Laudato Si, and Rerum Novarum was about civic virtues, among others, and the right to decent work. One of the examples that I find compelling and that I would like every student to hear, think about, write about, comment on, is a very poignant part of Populorum Progressio, where Pope Paul VI writes the following: "Everyone knows that the fathers of the church laid down the duty of the rich toward the poor in no uncertain terms." And let me underscore duty. As St. Ambrose of Milan put it, "You are not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving back to him what is his. You have been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich." How absolutely and teach our students about some guiding global
Thanks, everyone.
principles. The UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Global Biodiversity Framework. All of these 5 have been adopted by all 193 UN member states, but they're not being achieved. Second, we should teach about the barriers to integral and sustainable development, such as the failures of cooperation. We have a lack of trust, a lack of public goods, and certainly a lack of peace among nations. We have failures of social justice. We have what Pope John Paul II called structures of sin, the privatization of state power, government for sale, the monopoly of specialized information when experts hold their information for their own power rather than sharing it with society, unwanted surveillance and a loss of privacy. These are examples of structures of sin. The economic curriculum should explore the range of economic institutions that can help address these issues, and I won't discuss these at length, but it goes from family and households to corporate form of business, to local and central governments, to multilateral institutions, and to UN treaties and international law. And the economics curriculum should continue teach the various dimensions of economic ethics. Ethics of the individual, for example, the virtue of moderation, of generosity, of justice. Family ethics, responsible parenthood. Friendship ethics, corporate ethics, civic ethics, social ethics among different social groups, political ethics about state power, geopolitical ethics about international relations among nations, intergenerational ethics across time and generations, and ecological ethics. So this would constitute a different kind of curriculum. We would explain clearly the alternative philosophical approaches to economic ethics, introducing the ideas of Aristotle, Aquinas, and the Catholic social teachings about excellences of character and behaviors, the virtues to be cultivated in line with reason, principles of revealed truth in different religions, maxims of universal reason, such as in Immanuel Kant's ethics, or rules of effective governance, such as in Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. We would explore, and I won't go into length because of time, a basic idea, how to achieve cooperation. And what I'm showing here is the famous prisoner's dilemma game, where 2 parties should cooperate for their mutual benefit, achieving the upper left quadrant of cooperation. But because of self-interest, they each cheat on the other, and they both end up worse off. They end up in a bad outcome of a cheating, non-cooperative equilibrium, which leaves them both worse off. So cooperation improves the lot of society, but self-interest taken to an extreme leads to the collapse of the interests of the members of the society. And in the way we teach economics and game theory now, we say that the lower right-hand quadrant is a sad but inevitable outcome of self-interest. But the Catholic social teachings help us to understand how we can reach the upper left-hand quadrant to actually cooperate. And in a way, this is the big central message of Fratelli Tutti of Pope Francis. We would teach, finally, the underlying complexity of economics as a holistic system of systems that are affected by the institutions that we have, the way our company law is set or the way our governments operate, by economic ethics. by changes of technology and by natural resources and physical geography. And I think that this would lead to a far richer vision of economics and would help our young learners to appreciate much more the drama of the world that we are in and the ways that they can contribute to solutions. Just as a mention, I'm writing an economics textbook this year trying to think through how one would teach principles in this different way, and I hope many of you are doing something similar. But my idea is to look, given the fact that our economics textbooks, while they keep getting updated with new boxes and new examples, are very much like they were 75 years ago. And we need a different approach for the 21st century, founded on ethics and with the wonderful inspiration of the Catholic social teachings. So thank you very much for the chance to put these ideas with you today. Thank you.
Jeffrey, thank you so very much. You've given us a great deal to think about, and speaking for myself personally, it's really exciting to hear more about your work. I share many of your interests in my own work in the law, so it's great to have you here with us. I'm going to open it up for some questions, but maybe I'll start with a question of my own. As you were speaking, I couldn't help but think about what's happening in the economy right now, the way that a lot of assumptions around how labor should behave, how interest rates should behave and such have been upended by the post-pandemic movement of all kinds of things. And maybe it was the pandemic, that was the stimulus, but it seems like something changed in terms of how people view themselves as economic actors. Do you think there's any opportunity in what we're seeing around the changes in how people and the economy is behaving post-pandemic that might help us move your project forward?
Certainly people are reconsidering what they're doing, their lives, even where they live, how they work. And I think this reflects also that we were all jolted out of our normalcy, and people are trying to ask, what should I be doing with myself, with my family, with friends, how I should be living. It's not something that can be answered one at a time, though, so we need more of a society-wide discussion about these ideas. I think we need to understand much more clearly how some of the core assumptions that we have in our economic life just are not right. And I come back to the fact that it took me a long time, by the way, to even understand historically how odd some of our assumptions are and how very specific they are to British philosophical thinking that would not necessarily have had such a powerful effect were it not for the might of the British Empire that propagated these ideas around the world, seemed to justify them in a way. But once you start to look and see that a job is more than your income, and the market is not necessarily in fact, in many cases, it is a disastrous measure of real value, especially with our epidemics of addictions and terrible problems of falling life expectancy in the United States and even before COVID. The cause for rethinking is very strong. I'll give one pre-COVID example that shook me up many years ago until today. One of the drug companies was vastly overpricing a life-saving drug, which is pretty familiar for us. It was making an incredible mountain of money, and because the prices were so high, the epidemic, the hepatitis C epidemic that could have been ended by this quite remarkable drug was not being ended. And so I wrote an op-ed saying, this is terrible. We have a drug company that is price gouging, people are dying, and the epidemic is continuing when it could end. And somebody emailed me, a stranger emailed me from Wall Street saying, Mr. Sachs, I don't understand what you're complaining about. They're just profit maximizing. So you're an economist, what's your problem? And I wrote back saying, well, yes, but people are dying because of this. And the person wrote back, not mean or defensive, just straightforwardly said, but Mr. Sachs, that's our system. And it's shocking. That is a failure of ethical dialogue. That's a failure of ethical training. Should that be our system? Should we really be complacent when an epidemic continues to surge because of the strange way that we allow monopoly drug pricing? Is this appropriate? Isn't there a better way to the common good? So I think that if we take the examples, whether it is COVID or all of the other disruptions of recent years, these are fertile bases for opening up the minds of our students and discussion. And I think they're yearning for it, actually. They want not only how to shift various curves in class and what indifference curves are and how to prove that something is Pareto optimal and so forth, which they'll forget almost immediately unless they're among the tiny number that are going to study economics professionally. What they want to learn is how to reason about our situation and how to think about what could and should be done about our social life. And that is a different kind of teaching.
Professor Sachs, I'd like to thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I've been strictly informed that I have to keep us on time. So I know we had many other questions waiting in the wings, and I apologize to those of you who waited, but our time has ended. So I want to thank Professor Sachs for being with us today. You've really given us, as I said, a great deal to think about.